begin memorial services traditionally with words that essentially say we are here to mourn a loss and celebrate a life. We gather in both grief and gratitude. This morning, I say this to us as well. We gather in grief and gratitude for this past year's worth of plague. It has been 1 year since the first death attributable to COVID-19, a man in the Wuhan province of China. Since then, over 1.9 million people around the world have died from this plague. We are likely to hit the 2 million mark before the end of this month, possibly within this coming week. It has been a year, and the illness continues to spread. In the United States alone, we are adding 2,000 to 3,000 deaths to that total each day. We approach the 400,000 mark as a nation. And yet we've recently experienced a turning point in the politics of our country. Also, we have a vaccine beginning to be distributed. Indeed, a few members of this congregation have received their first doses. Better days are coming, but we are still in the thick of it. So we gather this morning in mourning. We gather in grief for what has been lost and in gratitude for the great turning we are experiencing. On balance, there is much for which we can be grateful. But before we tumble too quickly into that sigh of relief, let us pause together to acknowledge our losses and our grief. This has been a rough year. As Trebbe shared in the announcements, her organization, Radical Joy for Hard Times, is hosting a global day of mourning to commemorate a year since the first death attributable to the COVID-19. In connection with that, I invited Trebbe to share this sermon with me as a conversation. We will take turns asking each other questions over the next few minutes, circling around this theme of grief and gratitude in the pandemic.
This topic has been on my heart for a while now, and I'm very grateful to be part of this conversation. And Douglas, I'd like to start with a personal question for you. What's it like to be a minister during this pandemic? What about the challenges of trying to do Sunday services online? Did you give memorials or naming ceremonies or weddings that couldn't be done or had to be done in some other way? And what about pastoral care, which is so reliant on being there with a person who is suffering? And all of this going on while we are building our new building.
On March 22nd, we held our first 100% online streaming worship service. I titled that sermon, How to Stay in Touch Without Touching. I reminded us on that Sunday morning, back in the spring, that our core as a faith community is not found in a shared belief, but in shared values. One deep value that is like a golden thread for us is the value of connection. And this pandemic has hit us right in the heart of who we are as a faith community together. I also reminded us that Sunday, back in March, of an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I encouraged us to slow down, that we might go together and go far. Since that time, I have struggled with some aspects of this ministry in a pandemic. I was initially thrown by the difficulty of preaching when everyone is on mute and my screen is focused on the manuscript rather than on your faces. And it felt a little like preaching into a void. It helped to imagine you were all listening, and it has grown easier with practice. The other significant challenge has been not being able to visit the sick and people in nursing homes. I have relied on a ministry of presence and have struggled with how to keep connected with people who are in nursing homes and under COVID-19 restrictions with whom I am not able to be present. On top of that, this pandemic reactivated my own depression, which, as I talked about last month, tends to lead me into believing the worst about myself and my capacities as a minister. By the fall, most of it was under better control. I was on medication. I was more familiar with the ways we could use Zoom in worship to help foster connections. And I discovered many of you were also reaching out to each other, keeping in touch while we were not allowed to touch. You asked Trebbe about rites of passage, and I note that the very last event that we held in person as the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Binghamton was a memorial service that we did for Hada Libby at the Presbyterian building on March 15th. I have officiated at other graveside and funeral services as well as an outdoor wedding since this pandemic. And each of these events has been strained by the difficulty of the pandemic. Each has had to be adjusted or modified to allow for some of what we need to do to occur while allowing for the reality of health and safety precautions. None of us has been untouched by this pandemic. Trebbe, what challenges have you faced over this pandemic? What losses and changes in your work have occurred for you personally?
Well, the biggest loss for me, of course, was that Andy, my beloved husband, died. He didn't die of COVID. He died of advanced liver cancer, which was diagnosed just 5 days before he died. And I'm grateful beyond words that I was able to stay in the hospice facility with him, to do ceremony with him, and have some conversations about what it meant for him to die. And he went without regret or bitterness or anger or remorse. He was ready. And I am deeply grateful and moved that I was able to be holding his hand when he took his last breath. To be perfectly honest, there have been many times during this pandemic when I've been grateful that I'm a natural introvert, a kind of natural loner. I think it's probably easier if you're an introvert to spend so much time alone than it is for extroverts who really rely on the company and the presence of others for their vitality. But I must say I have missed physical contact a lot, especially in these months after Andy's death. I have been saved, I feel, by having 1 or 2 or 3 conversations on the phone or on Zoom every day, even now, 5 months later. And because I've been writing about this relationship between beauty and grief and joy for a long time, I think this pandemic has actually widened my sense of compassion. I often feel like the stories of countless others are kind of hovering in a place in my consciousness that's somewhere between memory and imagination. And the combination of my grief over Andy's death and that widening sense of the suffering of so many others is, I believe, what prompted me to create this Global Day of Mourning today. Douglas, tell me, what does it mean to you to grieve?
So simple a question, huh? Well, growing up in an alcoholic home, strong emotions were frowned upon. Anger and sadness were akin to weakness in some ways, or at least that's the message, the unspoken message that I had picked up. So I've spent a good portion of my adult life figuring out how to be appropriately angry or healthfully sad. And one clue that I keep returning to over the years is that such emotions are rooted in love and fear. Sorrow comes where love abides is a phrase that I say in the benediction of most memorial services. Sorrow comes where love abides. Our grief is born of love, and sometimes of our fear that the love is gone, never to return. To grieve is to allow yourself to feel the loss. Grief is the consequence of love, and love really is what this whole human experience is about. Trebbe, I turn the question back to you. Why would we want to set aside an entire day to mourn? Wouldn't it be better to try to get over it and focus on positive feelings?
I love this question. And I would say, first of all, that reading by Francis Weller, he sums it up. Grief helps us to be alive. Grief helps us to be real. It means we allow ourselves to feel the pain in our hearts and express it. I think that something that often happens is people feel like they should be controlling their suffering because they presume either that if they release it, if they share it, it will bring others down, or else that they feel that apologetic almost because somebody else might be suffering more acutely. Someone apologized to me a few days ago for grieving about the death of her cat when I am grieving the death of my husband. And I said, no, your cat died. That is your reality. That is your sad reality right now. There's a large effort in this country, especially with our focus on relentless positivity, to get beyond suffering, to put it behind us. And what happens when we try to do that is that we end up trying to put behind something that we haven't even faced in the first place. So we have to face the sorrow, whatever it's about. The death of a loved one, your inability to see your new grandchild at Christmas, your extremely confusing and isolating first year of college. We have to accept the reality of sadness and to cry over it. Since Andy died, I cry whenever I have to, sometimes with others and sometimes alone. In the beginning, that crying was like having something absolutely wrenched out of me, like being flayed. It was so painful. But then what I found that happens is that every time, even in those very beginning times, when I cry, the crying itself seems to heal something. I often have the feeling that grief is kind of like spitting me out of its own dark well back into the light. And that brings me to another understanding of what it means to grieve. It also means being able to not stay in that deep well beyond the necessary time. Now, that doesn't mean, in my experience, that you go through a certain number of weeks or months or even years of sorrow and then all of a sudden you start feeling better. It means you step in and out of grief daily. And I believe in experiencing both the light and the dark fully. When we're in the well of grief, we just need to cry. And then when it's over, we need to look around and say, what's calling me now? What's beautiful? How can I contribute? How can I live with as much passion and commitment and intention right now in my grief? Douglas, when you consider ways to grieve, what comes to you? Are some ways of grieving better or healthier or more likely to lead to healing than others?
There was a phrase that you used just a moment ago, the well of grief, and I think that that's very instructive. It's a place that we end up in that is limiting, circumscribed. A few weeks back, we had a Sunday service with a pre-recorded sermon from Rabbi Sharon Brose, And in that sermon, the rabbi talked about 3 movements we should go through as we move through difficult times. First, she said we should grieve. What follows is a capacity to speak truth and our ability to build a new future, and that this is a powerful blueprint the rabbi offered us for national and global change, as well as navigating the personal losses of our lives. So you ask if there are some ways of grieving that are better or healthier than others, to which I refer back to this blueprint. Does your grief allow you to then speak truth? Or does it bid you hide and be ashamed of what has occurred? Does your grief allow you to imagine a better day ahead? Nationally, I think our communal grief response to the coronavirus has not been healthy or productive because it has not led us to speak a communal truth about it. Too many lies have been allowed to flourish in the shadow of our loss and pain. There has been little to no acknowledgement by our government of the losses due to this plague. I believe our government is the body that could rightly lead us into the well of grief, into a national communal recognition of this experience, and a conversation of how we can move through and beyond this experience together. This is an experience that the whole world is having, that our country, sadly, is amplifying. We should be able to mourn the daily loss that is rolling over us. The fruit of healthy grieving is the ability to speak truth and to build a new future in the days and weeks to come. Grief is not easy, but it is extremely valuable. Trebbe, I want to wrap up our time with one more question. How can we do more than just cope with heartaches and difficulties? How can we thrive?
Well, first of all, to go back to what I said before, I think we have to begin by admitting our heartache, admitting the difficulty that we're having. We have to reach out to others and share with them by phone, by Zoom, in person, whatever is possible, and to honestly express what we're going through. And in that context, too, we have to remember that in that conversation or phone call or Zoom, that other people have lives too, and they have heartache and they're suffering. Opening up to the world of others enables us to open our own hearts more fully, and it works the other way too. It's also crucial to find life and beauty and meaning wherever we can. So I'll tell you a story. Less than an hour after Andy died, I had packed up our things in the hospice facility, and I was taking the first load out to the car. It was almost midnight. It was in August. And when I stepped outside that air-conditioned little building, I was absolutely astonished to hear the songs of katydids, this immense chorus in the woods, and behind, all around the building, and even on the other side of the road. And I just put down my bags and stood there listening for a minute. I was absolutely stunned to awe and infused with gratitude for the brilliance and the gift and the perseverance of this life that had absolutely nothing to do with my life, but at the same time had everything to do with my life, even at that most awful time. Nature and the kindness and the human sweetness of other people, something you read, something that happens just as some simple thing every day. The world is waiting to invite us into the wondrous and the beautiful. And we can say yes, we have to say yes to those invitations, even at the most anguishing times of our life. And finally, I'd say that thriving and not just coping means listening closely to our own inner voices and how they are compelling us to respond to life life, life, life. There are opportunities every day, many of them, not just to receive kindness and beauty, but to give it. To say thank you to the person working in the supermarket, to tell your friends something specific that you really appreciate about them, to volunteer for a cause you believe in, to pick up litter on the street. Rumi says, there are 1,000 ways to kneel and kiss the ground. There are also 1,000 ways to give beauty. And we can do that no matter what we're going through personally.
Trebbe, thank you for sharing this time with me. We have revealed together some deep and salient points as we have worked each to heal the world along with our own hearts this day. And as it says in the song, it is time now. It is time now that we thrive. It is time we lead ourselves into the well. It is time now. It is a time to be alive in this great turning. We shall learn to lead in love. May this hour open for us all a window through our grief and loss into the depth of human care and connection. May love continue to lead us in the ways of truth and grace. In a world without end, may it be so.